Hi, my name's Steve Madewell, and this is Ecophilia for April 2024. I'm going to let our guest presenter introduce himself and the topic at hand. So sit back and enjoy.
Okay. So I can't hit got it. Somebody needs to hit got it to clear the screen there. That's for you. Is it me? Oh, okay. I need to hit got it to clear the screen. Hey, there we go. Technology. Yay. Okay, well, thank you for coming, everybody. I'm Kevin Magee. I'm a local diver. I'm also a member of Ecophilia. I gave a talk a few years ago on lake ecology and a little bit of diving and shipwrecks as well. And this one's solely focused on shipwrecks. As you can tell, I'm involved in a lot of organizations that have to do with shipwrecks in the Great Lakes and Lake Erie in particular. Of course, I'm a co-founder of CLUE, the Cleveland Underwater Explorers. And when you see or hear about a shipwreck being found in Lake Erie, it's probably us. There's a few other groups doing it, and we pretty much do Western Basin off of Cleveland and even a little bit east to Ashtabula. So in the end, quite a bit with shipwrecks and finding new shipwrecks. To date, CLUE has found about 35 shipwrecks, I believe, last count. And then, of course, I'm also just a regular scuba diver. And so I'm a member of several scuba clubs, like the Bay Area Divers or BAD, or the Lake Erie Wreck Divers. You can see a pattern there. And I'm a member of various professional or semi-professional organizations as well. For instance, the Great Lakes Historical Society, everybody remembers that museum and pavilion. It's now moved to Toledo, and it's called the National Museum of the Great Lakes. If you've never been to that museum, I definitely recommend it. It's a beautiful museum. It takes all day to go through. If you have any history, maritime history, Great Lakes history, it's a wonderful museum. And then, of course, off of that, there's things like MASS, the Maritime Archaeological Survey Team. That is avocational groups of divers that actually go through underwater archaeology training for a 7-hour weekend. Then they do practice in the quarry and actually survey one of the ships that are in a local quarry. And I should say a motorboat, not a ship. And that's the most surveyed boat in the world. And then after that, you're a permanent member of the organization, and throughout the summer, they go out and they survey a shipwreck somewhere in Ohio waters. They've done, a good dozen to date. Sometimes it takes multiple years to do a shipwreck, because some of these things can be pretty big. In any case, a lot of stuff out there with the Great Lakes. And of course, we'll see. Oops, I'm not getting my advancer working. Okay, hold on. We've got browser screen. Let's see if I can get it moved. Now, yet another technical issue. I may have to. Yep. For whatever reason, it is not working. There we are. Just have to manually do it. Okay. So, for those of you that haven't seen it before, this is Lake Erie. If you've never seen it go north, you can't miss it. It's a large body of water, although it is the smallest of all the Great Lakes by volume. It's actually not the smallest by surface area. So when somebody tells you the largest lake or smallest lake, two questions: are you measuring by volume or are you measuring by surface area? Lake Ontario is actually smaller by surface area, but it's much, much deeper and has more volume. So depending on how you count, Lake Erie is either the smallest of the Great Lakes or it's the second smallest. And what most people don't know is this was the nation's highway in the 1800s. This is how people moved west. They did not get in the wagon train in New York City. They got on a boat. They went up the Hudson River. They got on another boat, went down the Erie Canal. Then they got on another boat somewhere in Buffalo there in the eastern end. And they go down the lake, settling along the shoreline as they went. Eventually, by the mid-late 1800s, people were going all the way from Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, going to Chicago. And in fact, if you went all the way to Chicago, you get on another boat, go down the Mississippi River, and then you get off at St. Louis, and then you get on the wagon train going west. That's how people moved west. There was no roads or railroads. You didn't go over land. It was hard, arduous, and dangerous. Much easier to go by water. And if it hadn't been for the Great Lakes, American westward expansion would have been completely different. So, and of course, you've got all these boats going west, and you've got boats going east, because a lot of these people are farmers, timbermen, people like that. They're producing grain crops. They are producing, they're felling timber to bring back to the developed east. Raw materials such as iron ore, all sorts of goods are going both directions, finished goods and coal from the east, raw materials coming from the west, people going both directions. And so the end result is you end up with very, very busy conditions on the Great Lakes. On any one season in the 1800s, there would be thousands of ships operating. Most of them would, of course. This is the days before radar and weather reports. So they tended to hit each other a lot, surprisingly amount. And they would catch fire. They would just break open seams in storms, and they sank pretty regularly. It was not an unusual event. And so there's a lot of shipwrecks out there, and nobody really knows the number. There could be anywhere from 500 to 3,000 ships in Lake Erie alone, which makes it one of the densest bodies of water for shipwrecks in the world, for large body of water. Not counting shoals in some small area where there might be 10 or 20 wrecks piled on a small rock. I'm talking a large body of water. And nobody knows how many are out there because nobody kept records. And there are two governments involved, Canadian and American. Both were very poor at keeping good records. Sometimes the only indication that a ship is out there is the local newspaper said that a ship sank offshore, and or the newspaper from where a large number of the crew came from might mention the ship going down. But even then, that doesn't mean there's a shipwreck there. These ships sank 2, 3, 4, 5 times in their lifetime. These are things that, yeah, they were vessels of commerce, and these were there to make money for the owners. So they get raised and put right back into service. Sometimes under a new owner, a new name. Maybe they switch owners, but keep the name. But in any case, the sinking always made the news. The raising might be a one-line mention in the newspaper 6 months to a year later. And if you missed it, you're looking for a ship that's no longer there. So in the end result, we don't know. Now, I suspect the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. I think probably 1,500 shipwrecks is a good number to start with, give or take a few hundred, either way. Today, almost 250 have been found. Maybe we're approaching 300. Here you can actually see some of the ships that have been found. This is not all of them. And you'll notice some patterns. You'll notice there's clusters around the Pelee Passage, or around Cleveland, or around Long Point, over on the Ontario side of the Eastern Basin. And those are places where ships kind of congregate. They've got to squeeze through restricted areas. They tend to run into land in those areas and shoals. So that's a higher density there. But it's also, that's because when people have looked. I guarantee you out in the middle where you see big blank spots, it doesn't mean there's not shipwrecks out there. It's just nobody's gone out to look because you need flawless weather. It's going to be a 60, 70 mile run just to get to the middle of the lake. And if the weather turns on you, and plus all the gas that it takes to get out there and back, plus 12 hours going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, there's very few boats that can do it and very few weather windows that allow you to get out that far and actually search for shipwrecks. So in the end, we really don't know how many are out there. But I'm going to give you an idea of what we do know is out there. And I'm going to break the lake up into 3 different sections: the Western Basin, the Central Basin, and the Eastern Basin. And the reason is because Lake Erie, for those that are boaters, and I don't know how many people have spent time on Lake Erie, but it's really 3 different lakes from a bathymetric standpoint and from a shipwreck preservation standpoint. They're very, very different conditions and very different bottom topography. So let's start in the Western Basin. Here it is. This is, of course, what most people think of when they think of Lake Erie. This is where all the islands are. This is where most of the marinas and boats are. And ironically, it's the worst place to go diving. The reason is it's so shallow. The average depth is only about 25 feet. It's a lot of rocky shoals, a lot of sandbars. It's a tough place to navigate, plenty of islands to run into, which is part of the attraction. People love going to the islands and boating around and standing on sandbars. That's great for that. But in the end, it's a very shallow, muddy part of the lake. Most of the mud from the Maumee River, Detroit River, and Sandusky all come out and kind of just fill up the bottom. It's a thick, gooey bottom, and visibility is usually very poor. Arm's length is a good day. 3 to 5 foot is very appreciated. I have seen up to 15 foot, maybe even 20 on the outskirts off of Kelly's Island once or twice, but it's pretty rare to get good visibility. And in the end, the wrecks are not as impressive. And I'll get into it in a bit, but most of it's because they're broken up. Because of the shallowness, they were probably cleared as hazards of navigation when they first sank. wire drag, dynamited, whatever, because they stick up. And last thing you want to do is have a ship sink and then have another ship come along, hit it, and sink right on top of it. And it's happened. There's a couple wrecks where that happened, actually. And so in the end, either people just scattered the wrecks or the ice scattered them. Ice can get down 20, 30, even 40 foot almost, and it'll churn up these wrecks, drag the equipment everywhere, flatten out the timbers. And so in the end, you don't get as impressive of a shipwreck. It's not what people think of. I'm going to show you one shipwreck just off of Kelly's Island, North Bay, at the end of that long point. And it's about 5 to 15 feet of water, and it's called the Adventure. This is what it looked like. It was originally built as a schooner, a sailing vessel in 1875. It served a very long life, almost to the 1900s, and it was wearing out, getting kind of leaky. And at this point, the age of sail had passed. Steamers were taking over. And so this is one of the ships that they converted from a sailing vessel into a steam barge. They essentially took down masts and put an engine boiler in it. And because it was a fairly old, leaky scow, it was used mostly for hauling stone from Kelly's Island to the mainland or various points of delivery, usually not too far. This is probably what it mostly looked like. And it was at the dock, which is no longer there. Kelly's Island used to be ringed with docks all around the island. Those docks are long gone, but they fed the limestone quarries to boats that then took the limestone elsewhere. This is one of those ships. It was at a dock and it caught fire. Nobody really knows the source of why it caught fire, but it did. So very quickly, one of the tugs, the tug Smith, actually cut the lines and towed it out into the lake so it would burn away on its own without taking out the dock and all the other ships that were at that dock. Unfortunately, the captain, his wife, and young daughter, and a few crew were still aboard. But no problem, the tug actually rescued them too. The vessel burned, drifted for a while, grounded, and then burned to the waterline and sank. Today, this is what it looks like. You can see that there isn't a whole lot left. It's mostly the keelson, or the keel. It's really the keelson, technically. And you can see the frames, or ribs, as people sometimes call it. All of the engine equipment, the anchors, all of that stuff was pretty much removed from the ship after it sank, were used in other ships, or used for scrap. And so in the end, you just have the bottom of the ship, maybe a little bit of the turn of the bilge, and that's about it. The propeller actually was left on it. It was taken, but now it's back on the wreck. For a while, it was on land as a display. And again, this is a classic example of a Western Basin shipwreck. Not a whole lot to look at, but it's still pretty impressive. And for those that noticed, this is actually when this was surveyed, this is one of the first archaeological surveys performed in Lake Erie in September of '97. And the organization that would become Mass did that, and that's why that's their logo.
Limestone.
What's that?
The limestone material.
Oh, so actually I had not loaded the limestone yet. So it caught fire sitting waiting to load, so it was empty when it caught fire. Which is good, because otherwise it would look like a pile of rocks. And you wouldn't even see it yet. So, this is another ship. It's kind of right at the edge of the Western Basin, but it shows another example of problems with ships in the Western Basin, and actually throughout all of Lake Erie. And that is this ship right here. It's right off of Vermilion in 50 feet of water, and it's the Anthony Wayne. It's a side paddle wheeler, very early steamer. It was invented at the time before propellers existed. You had a steamer in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. It didn't have a propeller, it had paddle wheels because propellers hadn't been invented yet. Propellers came out around the time of the Civil War, and they usually called those ships propellers, actually, instead of steamers. So they said steamer in the Great Lake, you knew that side paddle wheel. Traveling from Sandusky to Cleveland, it had been built in the 1840s, and traveling in April of 1850, a cold spring morning, and just left Sandusky with a load of passengers and general cargo that had been put aboard in Sandusky. 1 in the morning, the boilers exploded. This was not an unusual problem. So one of the things is I'm an engineer, and nowadays we have American Society of Mechanical Engineering boiler codes. We have steamship inspection services. We have lots of regulations for steam power. Back in those days, it was the Wild West. Anything goes. No inspections, no standards, nothing. And boiler explosions were not an unusual phenomenon. That's why these things actually exist, because boilers kept blowing up. They were brand new boilers too. They're less than a year old. It wasn't because of their age. Nevertheless,
Kevin? Yeah, Kevin, can you do us a favor? And I would like to ask you if you could slow down just a little bit in your vocal presentation, and maybe if you can get a little bit closer to the computer.
How's this?
That's better. And I think if you slow down just a tiny bit in your vocal presentation, it'll help.
Okay, I get excited when I talk about shipwrecks. I can't help it. Okay, so I'll pick up where I kind of started with the Anthony Wayne. The Anthony Wayne exploded at 1 in the morning. Its 2 starboard high pressure boilers exploded. And it was a cold April morning, 1850. At 1 in the morning, actually most of the casualties were in the saloon, which was right over the boilers. You can see the smokestacks there. That's where the saloon was. And curiously, it was packed at 1 in the morning. Don't know why, but that's where most of the casualties were. Apparently, it was part of the business model. Apparently, Anthony Wayne later in his life had a rather seedy reputation. But nevertheless, those that did survive the initial explosion, the ship sank very quickly. Fortunately, the hurricane deck, which is the, you can see the superstructure there, blew off in the sinking and was held to the wreck by cables. Most of the survivors actually got onto the hurricane deck. And out of the 3 yawl boats or lifeboats that were aboard, 1 was destroyed in the explosion. You can see 1 hanging off the stern there, and there's a 3rd somewhere that survived as well. The passengers were mostly that had survived were hanging onto wreckage or onto the hurricane deck that was floating. The captain and some crew got into 1 of the yawls. The first mate and some more of the crew got in the other yawls. They looked at the passengers, said, "We're going for help," and paddled away in opposite directions. Which again is not unusual. The whole women and children thing never happened. I've yet to hear an account in the Great Lakes where women and children first. That just wasn't. It's pretty much if anybody's going to live, it was going to be the crew. Because they knew how to get in the boats and launch them. And they did this very quickly, and they didn't wait around. Nevertheless, to their credit, they did actually go get help. A passing schooner actually picked up a lot of the survivors in the water, so they weren't there for too long. And they were taken back to Kelly's Island and Sandusky. Now, about 38 passengers and crew perished. And this is what it looks like today. You can see that this is a side scan sonar, so let me explain what a side scan sonar is. It's a sonar that you tow behind the boat on a cable usually about 100 foot long, and just like the name implies, it looks out to the side. So you don't see directly below the boat, that the boat is actually where that black strip is. It was going from the boat towing the side scan. This is Tom Kowalczyk's boat. In September of 2006, discovered the wreck. He was going from the south, from the bottom of the screen to the top. And you can see some structure. And what you're seeing is the side paddle wheels and the hubs that connect them, and just a little bit of the bow. The rest of it is all buried. And it is a very historic shipwreck. In fact, this is the earliest known steamer wreck in the Lake Erie, and we suspect all of the Great Lakes. So it's actually quite historic. It's now in the National Register of Historic Places with the National Park Service. And for those of you that cannot see what that picture looks like, think of it as an overhead aerial photograph taken with sound coming from that center line rather than light from overhead. But otherwise, you're looking at the lake bottom from overhead. So if you still can't see it, how about that? Is that better?
There we go.
So now you can actually see. This is a visualization done by Texas A&M. It's so important that they actually came up for 2 seasons and 2 seasons of excavations on the ship. They wanted to study the hull, and they wanted to study the horizontal crosshead engine, which is that in the middle of the hub, you can see a big bar coming off. It goes to the buried engine. Horizontal crosshead engines are pretty rare. Nobody had really seen one from that era, and now they've seen one. They did uncover it, and unfortunately, it had to fill itself back in after they uncovered it and examined it. But nevertheless, most of the ship is buried. And that's actually a problem with Lake Erie. It's a very thick, gooey bottom. Most of the other Great Lakes have a hard-packed sand or clay bottom. The ships literally teeter on their keels. Not true in Lake Erie. Most of the ships are sunk right up to their gunnels. Some are almost completely buried. And the Anthony Wayne is a really good example of that. The hull is there. It's just under the sand, the mud. It's thick, gooey mud, the type you can put your arm right up to with really no resistance at all. And so in the end, this is kind of one of the problems with shipwrecks in Lake Erie, especially the Western Basin. But it is still a very cool and historic route.
Kevin?
Yeah.
Being buried, does that enhance the preservation of the wood, or does that?
So the question is, does that enhance the preservation being buried? Yes, it does. One of the things that we have out there is this. So this is a paddle wheel. This is what you see on a really good day. It's probably about 5 foot of visibility, maybe 8 on the outside. It's actually better than any of the times I've ever seen it. And this is a picture of the paddle wheel and the arms or the spokes on just one particular part of one of the paddle wheels. And you can see like clumpy stuff there. And guesses what that is? Quaggas, yes. And actually, absolutely correct. It's quaggas, not zebra mussels. Zebra mussels were outcompeted by their cousin, the quagga mussel. Came from the same area, the Black Sea area of Europe. And it's they cover everything. And they're a mixed blessing to us divers. One, they have done a wonderful job of clearing up the water. 40 years ago, the water wouldn't have been this clear. Each quagga mussel can filter about a quart of water a day. There's trillions and trillions and trillions of them all over Lake Erie's bottom. And so they've done a wonderful job of filtering the water column. The problem is they cover the exact thing it is you want to see. And so you get this blob. And we call it shit thingies rather than whatever it actually is, because you don't know what it is. It's just a big nondescript blob. And you can kind of see how heavily they cover in some spots, not so much in others. There is a competitor out there, the round-headed goby, which comes from the same area as well, in the Black Sea, and it eats quagga mussels. So usually the horizontal areas we've discovered now gobies are eating the quaggas. Vertical areas, that's usually where you see a lot of the clumping. And nevertheless, it's kind of a mixed blessing. And turns out, to address your thing about preservation, it's cold, fresh water. Nothing rots, nothing eats the wood normally. There are no teredo worms in the Great Lakes. A wooden shipwreck could be there for hundreds and hundreds of years. I've seen steamers with paint from 1842. It's great, but quagga mussels, now that they're here, are attaching themselves to the wrecks, and they actually create a microclimate where metal and wood starts to actually rot, mostly from their byproducts. And so in the end, if it's buried, it's certainly going to be a lot better preserved. The zebra mussels are wreaking havoc, not just from creating the microclimate around the shipwrecks, but also because they weigh down the shipwrecks. Mass structures start coming down. Things that are delicate get covered and destroyed. And in the end, they are doing damage. So burial actually helps. That hull will be much better intact than if it were exposed in the long term. Here's that long rod that goes to the buried engine that I was talking about. It's called the Pitman arm. I have to show it, being an engineer, I have to show machinery parts. There is an oiler at the top, a couple of connecting linkages and cranks going off to the hubs that go off to the paddle wheels. And that kind of gives you an idea, I think, the Western Basin, what an average ship usually would look like, what would actually be the guidelines. So let's go east. Let's go now to the second part of the lake, the Central Basin. Central Basin is deeper, up to 80 foot out in the middle, and it's, as a result, it's more intact. Also, the silt has had a chance to settle out because most of the input is coming from the Maumee River, the west, as well as the Detroit and a few others. And as you go east, there's less river input, less silt, and all kind of starts to settle out. So by the time you get off of Cleveland, average visibility now is going to be 10 foot, 15 foot, see well over 30, 35 foot of visibility in Lake Erie off of Cleveland. And because it's deeper, the wrecks are more intact. They're not cleared as hazardous navigation. The ice can't reach them. And so let's take a look at some of the wrecks around Cleveland, because those are the ones that are best studied. About 40 are known in the immediate Cleveland area. You can kind of see the map there. And I'm going to talk first about the Dundee. The Dundee is 14 miles straight out of Rocky River, pretty much due north in about 68, 70 foot of water. And this is what the ship looked like back in the day. You can see that it's a 3-masted schooner, but it was again built in the late 1800s in 1893, and this is at the end of sail. It was never built to actually sail. It was built specifically to be what they call a consort. And a consort is where, because steamers were now pretty much in charge, but they were not the massive vessels that they are today, in the end, what they did is they would tow other boats behind them that were now obsolete, old sailing vessels, even specially built ones like this one, to double, triple, quadruple their cargo capability. This would make them more money. If it got bad, conditions were really awful, they would cast these ships loose to fend for themselves. They had crews aboard and minimal sails, basic rudimentary stuff. Their job was to either sail themselves to port and save themselves, or drop anchor and ride the storm out and get picked up again later. The Dundee had exactly that happen. Oh, by the way, if you look off the bow, you can see very faintly the tow line. This is, by the way, the Miztec. It's a sister ship of the Dundee, or very similar to the Dundee. And it sank in Lake Superior, and I've actually dove that ship. So I've actually dove the one in the picture here, but it's in a completely different way. This ship was traveling along in 1900, September of 1900. They ran into a very ferocious gale. What they didn't know at the time was the leftovers of the Galveston hurricane. The Galveston hurricane, of course, is still to this day the most destructive hurricane in the United States' history. Came ashore in Galveston on a nice fall day. Nobody saw it coming. And in the end, killed, well, they're not sure how many, but 10,000 or more people. Something goes high as 15,000. Wiped out Galveston. It was the New York of the Gulf. After that, it just became a sleepy resort town. It never thrived again. Swept up through the Midwest, came into the Great Lakes, western Lake Erie, and sank some ships. And Dundee was one of them. It was cast loose, quickly started to spring a leak. And so what happened was out of the crew of 7, a lot of times, the last thing you want to do is get in a really tiny boat in a big storm when you're already on a big boat, even if it's sinking. Lake Erie is so shallow that the strategy usually was, don't get in the yawl boat, climb the masts. They will stick out of the water after the ship sinks. And that's exactly what they did. They decided, we're climbing the masts. Out of the crew of 7, 6 made it, the captain and 5 crew. Unfortunately, the female cook did not make it. That is actually a very tragic pattern. If anybody's going to die, it's usually the cook. But probably because of the clothing of the day, we're not very conducive to climbing the shrouds and standing rigging. 2, not used to doing it for a living, where the crew did this every day. In the end, they hung on overnight, and the next morning a passing steamer picked them up. So only one died out of the sinking. Today, this is what the ship looks like. And again, this is that side scan image I was talking about. You can see how detailed it is. It's almost like you can go dive the shipwreck before you even get in the water. You can see the bow on the right and the stern on the left. The cabin blew off the sinking, so you can see the hole where the cabin was. You squint and look closely, you can actually see the floor joists. You can see all the cargo hatches. You can see where decking is missing, and you can see the deck beams underneath. You can see the bow up here. It's a little cluttered because it was a forecastle that collapsed. And there's a donkey boiler on it. You can see the stem and all the deck equipment on here. Like that's a winch right there. That's a bit. You can see all sorts of stuff, even before you get in the water. This ship was found back in the 1980s, and it's considered one of the signature wrecks of Cleveland. It's by far one of the best that's still very intact. It's 212 feet long, 30-foot beam, just a massive ship. Stands about 8 foot, maybe a little bit more off the bottom. And if you want to go dive it, this is what you'd see. So that's that deck winch in the middle of the deck that I pointed to earlier. It's still there from 1900. It was actually steam driven by that donkey boiler on the bow. So there would have been big straps powering it. But today, it's just the straps are gone along with sail and rope. That's usually the only thing that goes away on these ships. And now you just have the winch. That chain that you see attached to it is a modern chain. That's the mooring. One of the things about diving shipwrecks in the Great Lakes and Lake Erie in particular is you don't just get geared up and fall in the water and go to the bottom and swim around till you bump in the wreck. You'll never find it that way. You always want to connect to the wreck, usually with your anchor or through a mooring, so that you come down on the wreck. It's kind of bad if you go down your anchor line and there's no wreck. Now you got to attach a reel and off you go looking for it, and hopefully you'll find it before the end of the dive. In 10 or 15 feet of it, if you're not within 10 or 15 feet of the wreck, you'll never find it. So this is the preferred way of diving shipwrecks, and the mooring is there attached to a very sturdy deck object that's not going to move. There is now a mast mooring on it. They've moored 11 wrecks in Lake Erie in Ohio waters, and this actually goes to a concrete block off to the side, and then there's a jump line over to the wreck. Because even again, the concrete block 15, 20 feet away, no guarantees you're going to see the wreck from it. So you need a line to take you to the wreck. The tape that you see, that yellow line running through the middle, This was during the mass survey of the ship. So through these pictures, you're going to keep seeing that tape. That's just the baseline survey tape for the archaeological survey that was going on when these pictures were taken. This is the mizzen mast, the snapped off mizzen mast by probably ice that following season. Here's a diver on the wreck over the cargo hatch and some of the decking. You can see that baseline tape running through. Here's the mainmast collar. This is where the mainmast was. It looked like the mainmast was full. There's no sign of it. These masts were expensive. They were single pieces of wood, trees, and even in those days were very, very valuable. So more often than not, they would pull the masts before the ice came and took them down. So it looks like this was pulled. And this is one of the rare wrecks you can actually go inside. So inside, if you go down to one of those big cargo hatches, this is what you see. You can see Lake Erie shining up on the left there, in kind of a greenish blue view. And looking into the wreck, it's kind of dark. That's why we carry lights with us. And if you go inside, you have to be a little careful. You don't want to stir up the silt. But this is one of the safer wrecks because if you're having any problem, just go to the ceiling, follow the ceiling, sooner or later you're going to hit one of those massive cargo hatches and let your way out. So it's not too dangerous to go in. A lot of wrecks would be very dangerous to go inside that are heavily silted. This is not one of them. So let's look at another wreck in Lake Erie off of Cleveland. This one's off the east side, and it's called the Sultan. The Sultan is right off of Euclid, about 2 miles and 40 feet of water. It was discovered relatively recently by Clue. It's a brigantine built in 1848. And a brigantine is a 2-masted sailing vessel with the foremast square rigged. And the main mast is gaff rigged or fore-net rigged. And square riggers were not uncommon in the Great Lakes early on, in the mid-1800s, because they were doing the ocean tradition of building ships. They didn't know any better. Square sails are great for speed, but it takes a lot more crew to run. They are faster, but if you have to keep maneuvering, it's a lot of trouble to keep resetting those square sails. And they quickly learned you wanted really a gaff-rigged vessel. And pretty much by the late 1800s, any sailing ship that's being built were all gaff-rigged, all schooner-rigged, because you could easily sail closer into the wind, maneuver easily, and it took less crew to run, and less crew means more profits. So again, these vessels are here to make money. And so this was an early vessel just by the simple fact that it was square-rigged. It was built in Chicago, operated for years in the Great Lakes, actually operated for a while in New York City before coming back to the Great Lakes. It went up the St. Lawrence River and then came back right at the start of the Civil War. And it was operating out of Cleveland in 1864 with a new captain who wanted to show everybody how it's done, sailed right out into the storm and properly sunk herself. Its cargo is unusual. It's carrying grindstones from Bree, Ohio. The whole deck, as well as inside the cargo hold, is filled with grindstones. It's also carrying some lumber and barrel staves. But for the most part, its primary cargo was grindstones, which is a very unusual cargo. I've never seen that on another ship. And this is what the ship looks like today. It's, again, sitting in relatively shallow water for its very intact condition. It's leaned a little to the starboard side by about 30 degrees. And you can see all along the starboard railing, those little Cheerio-looking things, that's the grindstones. They all slid to that side. In fact, that's why the ship partly reason sank. It sprang a leak. It bottomed out on the sandbar that existed in the valley at the time, or the river at the time, and started this leak. They were trying to get east and beach the ship, and they were tossing grindstones overboard as they did. Unfortunately, that meant now the grindstones can start moving around, and they all slid to one side. The ship heeled over, and down it went. Again, the crew did take to the masts. Unfortunately, the foremast broke, taking 4 of the crew with it. And the main mast had 3 on, the captain, his brother, who was second mate, and the first mate. And over the night, the captain dropped off, his brother dropped off, leaving only one, the first mate, Eli Spears, to be picked up by a passing ship the next morning. Even taking to the mast wasn't a guarantee of success. It's very intact. It's what I call a diver's wreck. And today, it's a place that a lot of divers, this is their first Lake Erie shipwreck. There's, again, a mast mooring on it. And this is what you see when you first arrive on the wreck. Is the concrete block is tied right off of or in the bottom, right off to the windlass. The windlass is a big horizontal winch that's used to raise the anchors. It's covered in quaggas, as you can see, but if you look closely, you can still see the anchor chain wrapped around it and the chain locker there right behind it. The railings were intact. which is unusual. Usually, again, railings come down, things like that. These railings are strong and beefy, and they're still there today, which is unusual. And there's those grindstones. I love those grindstones. For those that don't know me, I'm also president of the Cleveland Geological Society, so this is very exciting. And there's all different sizes. They're up to 5 foot big, they're 4, 3 foot big. These, by the way, in the 1800s, Berea sandstone was world renowned for its grindstone capabilities. These grindstones were headed to Buffalo to be taken down to New York City and distributed all over the world. That's how popular Berea grindstones were. Like, grindstones were used for sharpening tools, by the way. These are not millstones. So that's a completely different rock and completely different use. Nevertheless, they're everywhere. They're stacked. They're all up against that bridge. And this is the final archaeological sketch for the mass survey. This is what it looks like when you actually do a baseline and you spend a couple years surveying it. I'm doing a very, very precise sketch. Not too bad from the initial survey sketch that I showed you earlier. Pretty accurate. And you can see the cabin again at the left there with the floor joists. Okay, so that gives you an idea what's off of Cleveland. Now let's go east, because east is where all the best wrecks are. It's deeper, up to 100 or 210 feet deep off the tip of Long Point, which is that big long thing coming out of the Canadian side. And right off the tip of it is the 210-foot hole. There are no shipwrecks there, but there are 4 shipwrecks in the 180 and 190-foot area right around it. I've been on all 4, well, 3 of the 4. And I'm going to show you a ship today that's near Long Point, but not quite as deep. Visibility here is great. If we don't have at least 40, 50 foot of visibility, I'm disappointed. I've seen well over 100 foot of visibility. I've seen whole ships from bow to stern, ships that are canal schooners that are 100, 120 foot long. Really, really impressive. The only problem is it looks like tropical water, but it's 41-degree water. So it's a little chilly, and no pretty fish and coral either. And the ship I'm going to show you right now is the St. James. It was a 2-masted schooner. It sank 8 miles off of Long Point in 165 foot of water. Now, recreational scuba diving is limited to 130 foot of water. So this is what's called a technical wreck. You need some helium to go to it and more equipment and specialized training. But it's a very routine dive otherwise. And this is what the ship looks like. This is the pirate ship from Disney, pretty much. This is what exists in the Great Lakes. And this is why Great Lakes shipwrecks are some of the best in the world. Everybody says, Chuck Lagoon, best shipwreck diving in the world, or Panama City, Florida, or Fort Lauderdale. Every place claims to be best shipwreck diving in the world. And they're all very nice, don't get me wrong. But they don't have intact wooden schooners from the 1800s with standing masts. You can see the cabin is still on it, bowsprit jib boom, bobstay chains, with stocked anchors still hanging out the cabinets on the bow. This ship sank slowly. The cargo hatches are still in place. And normally those blow off in the sinking along with the cabin. We don't know what happened. In fact, we didn't even know what it was for quite a few years after it was first found. It was found in the 1980s, and at first it was called Schooner X. It was a mysterious 2-masted schooner with canal schooner dimensions. That means it was made to fit through the Welland Canal. And eventually it was identified, and it turned out to be the St. James, curiously built in Milan, Ohio, the birthplace of Thomas Edison. Now, most people don't know it, but Milan, sleepy little Milan, Ohio, was the second busiest grain port in the world in the 1830s and 1840s. How did they do it? They're way far inland on the Huron River. They built a canal and then an artificial harbor on the north side. Next time you're in Milan, you'll actually still see, in fact, they built a bike path along the top of the wall of the artificial harbor. That was an artificial harbor with a shipyard. They built over 50 ships there. Carts would line up for 20, 30 miles outside of Milan to deliver their grain. It was the only way to get your grain to market back in those days. And you can still see some of the grain silos and the floating chutes. Now it's all bare ground, but it was a harbor at one time. And then they go up the canal into the Huron River, sail up out into Lake Erie, and deliver the grain all over. So this is one of those ships that was built there. We don't know what happened. It set sail in 1870, headed for the Welland Canal, and was never seen again. Just disappeared with its crew of 7. To this day, we don't know what happened. The ship looks perfectly intact, no fire, no collision. Nothing that would even indicate a storm. The time period it disappeared, there wasn't any really crazy weather. The yawl boat off the stern is missing, so the best we can conjecture is that something made them leave the boat, get in the yawl, and they never made it to shore. And the ship just slowly sank because it's in such great condition, eventually settling on the bottom. It's a beautiful, beautiful ship with 2 standing masts. Here's a look at the stern. You see the transoms there, the rudder is there, the undersides of the ship, just beautiful, really gorgeous. And oh, if you look closely, you'll see the ship's wheel there, right behind the cabin on the aft deck. It's just a gorgeous ship. By the way it was identified was with registration numbers. In 1868, they started to require registration numbers to be carved on the main hatch only. Before that, it wasn't really required. These ships don't come with a bell with a name on it. There's nothing carved in wood and a big nameplate or anything. That just wasn't normally done. The name was usually painted on the bow and on the stern, and that's it. To identify these things is very circumstantial. You've got to go through a whole list of candidates trying to narrow it down, find something unique to tell you it's this particular ship. That can be very hard to do. We have a lot of unidentified ships as a result. It was lucky that this thing sank in 1870, 2 years after they required the registration numbers to be carved in. If it sank before 1868, we'd know nothing about it. We'd still be calling it Schooner X to this day. So in the end, we now know it's the St. James. We now at least know what happened to it. But you can see it's just a gorgeous ship. And this doesn't be like if you were to dive it. Again, you need a little bit more equipment. So you're diving doubles and stage bottles. You got to do some decompression. It's a little bit more trouble, but this is what you get to see. There's that wheel. It is half covered in silt. And again, that's because Lake Erie is a silty lake. This is kind of the trade-off. But nevertheless, you can see the cabin, the companionway on the right there into the cabin, some windows into the cabin. Inside the cabin, you can see furniture poking out, some paneling for what was rooms and things at the time. A little tight of a fit in there with all that equipment, but you can see plenty from the periphery. You don't really need to go inside. That little bump right behind the companionway is a grill over the stovepipe, or the stove that was on in the cabin. The crew was always running across the deck and the roof to do the masts, and they didn't want them to kick the stovepipe, so they put a grill over it. And this is one of the cool things about diving shipwrecks. Nobody talks about that. There's no drawings for any of these ships. These ships were made by craftsmen by hand, using wood and their hands, and not really any drawings. We don't know how they were built. But when you find a shipwreck, you start to see details of how they actually built these things. Made out of wood, white oak, that no longer exists. Michigan at one time was covered in white oak, the size of redwoods, 10-foot diameter, hundreds of feet tall. They clear cut every single tree. Not one is left. By the 1800s, the last tree was fallen. These ships were built with that wood, along with Chicago and all those other wooden buildings. Every city built wood. And this is one of the byproducts. So you couldn't make a ship like this today. Not in the same style with the same wood. Midships looking forward. Here's the foremast standing. That's actually a wooden hand pump, single barrel hand pump. There's a sheet winch. See a boom or a gaff laying on the deck off to the side. You can almost see the windlass, the end spool of the windlass just beyond toward the bow. And if you go up the bow, there's those woodstock anchors. It's hanging off the catheads. Catheads are little cranes. That's how they see a pulley in the end of it. Once they got the anchor up and ready to clear the water, the crane kept it hanging off the side so it didn't scrape up the side of the ship as it came up. And they called them catheads. Different styles. This is the L shape, which is a early build style. And this is a big woodstock Admiralty anchor. If you found this anchor in the ocean, you would only see the metal parts, the shank, flukes, the arms, that's it. There would be nothing else. The wood would be long since gone. And the Great Lakes, still there. It's the pirate ship. Look, a pirate anchor. The only thing missing is the skeleton at the wheel. That's the only thing we're missing. Now this ship has something that's also a little unusual. Another misconception that people have is that all these ships had figureheads. No, not at least in the Great Lakes. Can't speak so much for the ocean, but the Great Lakes, figureheads were incredibly rare. I can count on 2 hands the total number that are known in the Great Lakes, less than 10. That's it, for all the ships that sank. And the reason is those things cost money. These things, ships are made to make money. Now, it was built early enough in 1856 that they were still putting a little pride of ownership in, so they did the next step. That's a scroll head. It's kind of a fiddle design, and not a lot of ships had that, more earlier than later, but the fact that it has it actually is pretty identifying. That's really cool and not so common. So, of course, just like on land, as a diver, you want to get up close and get your picture taken with the really cool thing on shipwreck. And so this is what Vlad is actually doing. She's getting up close, and her friend Tom is taking her picture of her. You can see the bowsprit and the jib boom overhead, some bobstay, martingales, chains going by, and I wiggle in there and take my picture. And it's really cool. Everybody wants to see this all day. It's another fascinating thing with the St. James.
Just given my nature of the center of the qualities and ultimately contribute to the degradation of the water. This is such a thorough, spectacular wreck. Is there any effort to conserve it?
So the question is, what do you do to save these shipwrecks? There isn't much you can do. So there is one example of a ship raised in the Great Lakes, and it didn't go well. The Alvin Clark is its name. It was found in Green Bay in Lake Michigan. In the late 1960s, it was a perfectly intact schooner sitting on the bottom. They raised it, perfectly legal to do that back then. It is illegal, by the way, to bring anything up now. It's best to leave it intact because if you bring it up, they guaranteed destroy it. And the Alvin Clark's a good example. So they brought it up. It looked perfect. Once they pumped it out, it actually floated for the first year or two. And then, of course, this wood's been underwater for over 100 years. It starts to dry rot. The cell structure starts to collapse because, all the pulp is so waterlogged. And as the water evaporates and leaves, the cell structure of the wood becomes unstable and all collapses. And they tried to save it. They put it on land. They tried to raise money to conserve it. But you have to understand how much money it costs to conserve a wooden shipwreck. A good example would be the Vasa in Sweden. The Vasa sank in the 1600s in the harbor of Stockholm. And it just, on its maiden voyage, it was the aircraft carrier's day. The king kept saying, put more guns on, put more guns on. And the thing was so top heavy, the first gust of wind, it just rolled over and sank. Very embarrassing, killed a lot of people. But in the end, in the 1970s, they found it buried under silt in the Baltic, which is only partly salted. So they don't have tornado worms eating as much wood there. And it was mostly buried too. They raised it. And since the 1970s, they've been trying to stabilize it. It's considered a national treasure of Sweden. They, at this point, I am sure, have spent $50 to $100 million at least. It's still unstable. They're still trying to stabilize it 40, 50 years later. Even a simple schooner like this, $50 to $100 million to stabilize, maybe if you can pull it off. And I say maybe because they also raised another ship in Great Britain and England in the 1970s, the Mary Rose. The Vasa was held together with trunnels, wooden pegs, 3 nails. They always pronounce them trunnel. Weird thing with the maritime things. They never pronounce them the way they're spelled. The Mary Rose was held together with iron spikes, very much closer to the style of construction of the Great Lakes. They did the same thing. They've spent tens of millions of dollars trying to stable the Mary Rose, and they just discovered that the treatment solutions are interacting with the iron spikes of wood and creating sulfuric acid. They are now faced with the prospect of taking the entire ship apart, separating the metal and wood, conserving each separately, and then putting the whole ship back together. So this is the problem of conserving things. And yes, the quagga mussels are bad, but if you bring it up, you're going to make it much, much worse. And you better have a lot of money, a lot of money. They never did raise the money for the Alvin Clark. In the end, they bulldozed it into a landfill. It's gone. So they destroyed it by bringing it up.
What was the Alvin Clark name?
The Alvin Clark, I believe, was built in the 1840s or 50s, sank around 1860 or 70, if I remember correctly.
Doesn't have anything to do with the Alvin Clark telescope.
No. Named for somebody else, probably. Another Alvin Clark. Okay, I'm going to show you one more shipwreck. Let's see, we're kind of going over in time here. This one, you don't have to be a technical diver to see really cool shipwrecks. I'm going to show you one that's really close to the St. James. It's called the Trade Wind. It's just a few miles away, but it's only in 120 feet of water, which makes it very diveable. To any advanced scuba diver, no special equipment or gas is required, and this is what it looks like. That's a three-masted sailing vessel, a barkentine, which means the foremast are square rigged, the other two are gaff rigged. And you can see it's beautiful. It's completely intact. The masts are down. They're all laying off to the side, and that's actually my favorite part of the dive. I'll go out there and look at that square rig mast all day long. The deck is there. It was sailing, built in 1853. It was sailing December 1st, 1854. It's near Long Point, trying to maneuver through what was called the Long Point Cut. There used to be a channel that just naturally opened at the base of Long Point for a while and closed up later. And coming out of the cut was the Charles Napier, leaving Buffalo, headed up that. And they saw each other, but there's snowstorms and squalls around long before the days of radar and radios. And they lost sight of each other. And the next time they saw the Charles Napier, it was right off their starboard bow, and it hit them. And then backed off and disappeared in the snow squall and couldn't find each other again. It did leave a present behind. You can see the collision hole right there in the center front part. That's the hole left in the ship. The trade wind did sink pretty quickly with a hole that size in it. The Napier did leave a present. That hole that you see there is the jib bone from the Charles Napier. It's a part of the ship that hit it, which is kind of cool. Not so cool for the sailors. Their yawl boat, which is hanging off the bat, was destroyed in the collision. But aboard, they had two government service lifeboats as deck cargo. They complained bitterly about them being in the way, but they weren't complaining at all when they started sinking, and they used them to save themselves. There's no fatalities. Sunlight was a good thing. Deck load also included iron railroad rails. That's what those matchstick-like things are there. And otherwise, the ship is completely intact. Cabin is there, deck equipment's there, windlass anchors are all there. If you go diving midships, this is what you'll see. You can see some of the railroad rails. You can see the capstan standing there. It's a vertical winch that they use to move cargo and raise and lower sails. Some of the mast structures laying off to the side there. Deck's intact, railings are mostly intact. Just a beautiful, gorgeous ship. The bow, you've got the windlass, two anchors sitting on the deck, and if you look closely, there's a small pitching anchor ended up under the windlass spool. From the front, you can see the whole thing's tilted again about 30 degrees to port, and that's why all the railroad rails slid to that side. Here's that cabin, twin companionways, one on each side. A lot of room inside, actually. People sometimes go in, but they start to fill and make everybody mad at them, so we try to discourage it. You don't want to be inside. You're just going to ruin everybody's visibility. And you can see a little skylight in the middle there. The middle of the roof, a little triangular skylight. And if you go to the stern, coming out of the roof of the cabin is the ship's wheel. Really cool. And if you go off the back side, the whole back is the scour hole. See the transom, the rudder, all the underside of the ship. Beautiful, gorgeous ship to dive. So I think that gives you an idea of what's out there. These are the shipwrecks in Lake Erie. Lake Erie is not unique. All the Great Lakes have these ships. It's really incredible, the history that's out there. And that's why, in my mind, this is still the best shipwreck diving in the world. These are little time capsules. For the day after the battle, like the Civil War fort, everybody left. And everything's pretty much there, except for the rope and the sail, maybe the paint now with the crag muscles around. But overall, it's like your own personal private museum. No velvet ropes, no glass cases. You can look at it, and to me, that's the exciting thing. You really get to see history. And the treasure, there are no treasures out there. These were poor sailors. They weren't carrying gold. The treasure is the ships themselves. That's the treasure. So thank you. If anybody has any questions, be happy to answer them.
Yeah, Kevin, thanks a lot. You made a reference of that great storm of Galveston, that hurricane. Just as a side note, it's a fantastic book out there called Isaac Storm, and it's well worth the read. And it not only talks about the devastation of that storm, but it talks about the creation of the National Weather Service. And one of the things that's real fascinating about that is Cuba tried to warn the United States about the oncoming hurricane, and because they were an island nation, we disregarded their. But I did not know that the storm actually had such a great effect that it would have sank a boat on Lake Erie. So that's quite fascinating. Any other questions for Kevin?
Yes. Now, when you get inside some of these really intact ones, there are trunks and cargoes. Have you ever found any organic materials like textiles or leather or shoes?
So the question is once we get inside these wrecks, what do we find artifact-wise as far as textiles and shoes? Textiles usually go away, unless they get buried, in which case you're not going to find them. Because, again, a really good way to piss off your diver friends is start digging in the muck. Visibility goes to zero, nobody's going to see the shipwreck, and now everybody's really mad at you. So if it's buried, we're not going to see it, and it probably would preserve the textiles. But if it's out in the open, shoes actually preserve really well. I've seen actually boots, shoes, eyeglasses, pocket watches, dishes, lots of dishes, and pottery, things like that. You see things that are not unstable from that were brought away in 100 years. Curiously, the grain cargoes tend to be intact. We've held 100-year-old grain corn in our hands. The top layer gets a little moldy, but underneath is perfectly intact wheat, barley, corn, all sorts of things. In fact, that's sometimes used to try and identify the ship. What type of grain was it carrying? You can actually knock out some possible candidates that way. So the grading stays pretty intact, except that little moldy layer. The textiles, though, I've never seen textiles. I have seen rope. The relatively recent shipwreck that sank in the 1920s. When I was deep inside of the forecastle deck, peg was a coiled thing of rope. It was jelly-like. You could tell if you got too close to it, you'd just a wrong thing get right to kill it. So I just kind of backed away very carefully. But there was still jellyish kind of rope hanging there from the peg from 1920s.
The reason I asked is in Kansas City, it's the Arabica,
Yes.
which sank in the Mississippi River. I don't know, 1840.
It was right after the Civil War.
The river shifted its course, and so it was buried elsewhere and took a long time to find, but they have extracted whole villages of equipment.
Yes, I've seen the museum, and it's incredible. The key, though, is that when the Mississippi River changed course and being buried under silt, perfect preservation. And that's really, a lot of archaeologists actually want ships to stay put and be buried because they have a chance of survival. Exposure usually means degradation, sooner or later. It's just a question of how long. And even ocean ships, so especially ocean ships, salt water, very corrosive on metals, lots of critters that eat wood and other organic materials. I think the Titanic is actually a perfect example of that. So people think they see the deck planking still in the bow. No, that deck planking was eaten away within 10 years of the Titanic sinking. What they're seeing is the caulk lines. That's what they're seeing. It's not, the wood's gone. I'm sure some people have seen the infamous pair of boots on the bottom. There was a person in those boots, but probably in the first, again, 10 years of sinking, treacle worms ate every scrap of organic material, the clothing, the person, but those were tanned leather boots, and they didn't like that. That was not tasty. Those are still there. You see stacks of china on the bottom. How could, the Titanic breaking in half and things raining down miles in the water and landing on the bottom, could you have a perfectly stacked set of china? Well, it was in a cabinet. Cabinet broke loose, landed on the bottom, and the treacle worms ate all the wood around, leaving a perfect stack of dishes sitting on the bottom. It's exposure usually means degradation. The ocean's a classic example. But even the metal, those rust sickles, that's bacteria eating 100 pounds of steel a day on the Titanic. They're actually metabolizing the iron. Flash forward several hundred years, it's going to be a big rust pile. So things that get exposed in the ocean will ultimately go away. It's just how fast. The ocean a lot quicker, cold fresh water a lot slower.
Is there a code conduct that our Lake Erie? I imagine it's a reasonably small group of people that are diving on the rocks. But as you say, if we were to piss off other divers, start locking things up. Is there, are people going to look for souvenirs to take from the wrecks or certain guides that supervise that or advises?
So the question is there a code of ethics for divers in this actually relatively small community where most people know each other about preservation and keeping the wrecks intact? And the answer is yes. Again, I mentioned kicking up the silt or digging in the silt definitely does not make you any friends on the boat. By the same token, we're very protective of our shipwrecks. Now, it is illegal. So no matter where you are, Canada, any state in the United States, if you're in the Great Lakes, it's illegal to take something. It has been since the 1990s. But that doesn't mean there's a few people with sticky fingers around there. They just have to have some. There's actually a case that happened about 15 years ago now, where a wooden steamer called the Brunswick, in the eastern basin of Lake Erie, they went out to dive in the spring after the winter storms and spring storms subsided, and there was actually a little bit of the silt moved around, and it uncovered an axe. And nothing spectacular, like an axe you'd find in a hardware store. Nothing unusual about it, but it was from the shipwreck. And so people were very excited, word got around, disappeared within a week. Somebody took it. Everybody knew who took it from the local community. And I guess after he took it home, put it in a bath of water, and went on vacation to Florida. And this was at the beginning of the internet, and oh my goodness, the online firestorm that erupted. They were threatening to go sink his boat, burn his house down, break into his house and take it. It got very ugly. To the point where one of his friends called him down in Florida and said, "Send me your house keys, we have to give this axe back." He did. They gave the axe back, and I just saw it last year on the run. So that's an example of how protective divers can be. If we find out somebody took something, it's not pretty.
But it's self-police.
So technically he should have been charged. But again, local police don't really care. Most people don't even know there's shipwrecks out there. So it would take quite a bit of effort. But ultimately, at the state level, people do care. The state archaeologist usually, or the Ohio Historical Society, or somebody like that, History Connection now. Those type of people care, but, and would maybe ultimately press charges if it was worth it. Because the axe was returned, no harm, no foul, right? In the end, it is very much self-policing. In fact, there's not archaeologists out there diving these ships every day, every year. It's the local dive community that keeps an eye on them, notices changes in conditions, notices artifacts coming or going, getting buried, or suddenly being unveiled, structures collapsing, things like that. It's the local dive community that has the most interest and is really the kind of the protectors of the wreck.
This is not inexpensive.
So people often ask, do you find treasure? Usually I get asked three questions. One is, first, you dive Lake Erie? Can you see anything? The second question is, do you see bodies? And the third question is, do you find treasure? And the answer is no to all of those. And yes, I can see. Because these were poor sailors. They only get paid at the end of the season, if they live that long. And they got paid in paper scrip on shore. So there's no gold on these ships. These ships were really poor. They were usually operating on margin. You could make a lot of money as ships got bigger and were owned by groups of owners rather than single individuals. In the end, you spend a lot more money at this hobby than you make. It's a hobby. You're not supposed to make money. And so, yeah, it's completely cash flowing one way. You don't make money going the other way.
There's a lot of stuff that's been brought up from the Titanic. They got exhibits and everything, and I guess they do have some protocols and rules or something.
So, the ocean's a very different place, legally.
But considering that in 100 years, it's just going to be a pile of rust, isn't there some value in trying to find out what's in there? Or?
Yeah, I'm actually very much with you on that. I think, again, the ocean is a very different environment than the Great Lakes. If you leave it in the Great Lakes, chances are your children will see it, and your children's children will probably see it. The ocean, that's not true. And I know there's a lot of controversy about bringing things up from the Titanic. It's a grave site, you should leave it undisturbed, blah, blah, blah. But if you leave it, nobody will ever see it. And it will get destroyed sooner or later. It will be crushed, decayed, whatever. And I think there is a lot of value in bringing up stuff from the Titanic to remind people of the loss. And the whole grave argument. So it's not like when somebody dies on a highway, you close that section of highway and never visit it again, right? Think of Civil War battlefields. Lots of people died on them. Does that mean you should never walk on those fields again? I mean, there's people still buried there. Just buried them in place with no grave marker or wood that long rotted away. And there's bodies out there. Should you never visit those sites? And I think shipwrecks are very much the same way. You should be allowed to visit these sites respectfully. Don't go out there with a metal detector and start picking things up like a Civil War battlefield. And there's plenty of room for archaeology for important things, to bring up and show. The museums, as we all know, have very limited space and limited budget for conservation. And so in a lot of cases, it's probably best to leave. But the Titanic is one of those special exceptions where it probably should bring it up. Because in a way, it's kind of a way to honor the people who lost their lives, a way to remember. And the worst thing that can happen is everybody forgets. And without that Titanic display, people would be forgotten. Without that movie, people would be forgotten. It's, I think, an honor to the people that died that we remember. And that's a great way to remember, especially since those artifacts will be going away eventually. So yeah, I'm very much in your area.
I want to reiterate, Kevin made a comment early on about the Great Lakes Museum in Toledo, and it is a great museum. It's absolutely worth the stop down there, and they've done a tremendous amount of work on the Maumee riverfront in the past several years, and so the whole area is quite vibrant, and it's worth a trip over there to check that out. Kevin, you made a mention of the Maumee River being the primary silt load. Is there any kind of I can think of one historical reference that illustrated the shift in silt loading in Lake Erie, but that came at the time that the Black Swamp was drained and the trees were cleared. From a diving perspective, are there any kind of historical mile markers where things or conditions are changed as a result of land use, and that's reflected in any of the relics that you find?
Kind of a fuzzy answer on that one. So there were divers in the 1800s. Another thing about treasure, if somebody lost their bag of gold, somebody would have been paid to go get it. There were divers in the 1840s and 50s, hard hat, divers. They called it diving in armor. And there were even several that wrote books, like Johnny Green, John Harrington, who were divers of that time period. And they do describe what they saw in Lake Erie.
Okay.
Johnny Green in particular, he wrote a book later in his life when he was crippled from the bends, because they still didn't know what the bends were. They knew nothing about that while diving. And in the end, he describes Lake Erie as being fairly clear. Of course, the time he's diving is 1840s, 50s, into the 1860s a little bit. And that, as you pointed out, the Maumee River used to be the Great Black Swamp, and its silt load was way, way, way down before the swamps were drained, and now it's a major agricultural reason, and that's why the Maumee River is so muddy now, is simply because of all of the agriculture. And it's directly tied to the phosphor problem and the algae bloom problem in Lake Erie. The Maumee River is responsible for most of it. There are some others, a little bit of the Detroit River and some other minor inputs, but the vast majority of it, the fertilizer to solve the no-till, and loss of topsoil problem, those fertilizer pellets getting into the Lake Maumee or Maumee River and out to Lake Erie are the big problem. And so Johnny Green does give indications that, again, they dove with no lights, but he could see really well. He always seemed to be able to see, unless he was very deep. And then it was just dark because they had no lights. So in the end, that's about the only thing I could say of an indication that earlier Lake Erie was clear, based on his descriptions.
Thank you. Now, the reference I was thinking of validates that, and that was from Winus Point, the historical conservation duck hunting club over on the western side of Lake Erie. They've kept meticulous records of their bird harvests over the decades, and they're over 120 years old. And when the Black Swamp was drained and the turbidity of Maumee Bay and Sandusky Bay changed, they no longer shot as many diving ducks. They all were, mallards and what are often called puddlers, because the underwater vegetation disappeared. And so I wondered if there was any kind of cross-cultural reference to that in your community, and thank you.
Yep, yeah, there certainly is some indication of that. I'll also point out they used to drink the water directly out of the lakes in the early ships. They never even bothered carrying water because there was the sweetwater seas.
Yeah.
All this water, you just put the bucket on the other side and take a drink. Nowadays, and by the late 1800s, nobody thought of doing that, especially near urban areas. And they all started carrying fresh water tanks on them for drinking water rather than just drinking whatever they were sailing through. So another indication of the water quality changing over time.
Well, any other questions or comments here before we wrap things up?
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you very much. It was great.
Yeah, thanks.
Any structures or motion photogrammetry of any of the wrecks?
They finally do photogrammetry in one. Off of Cleveland, not going so well. They are in the Eastern Basin though. There's several wrecks that have been photogrammetry.
It was Lake Truck.
Yes, and they've done some really good work in the Eastern Basin Lake Erie. In fact, there is a group or a person out there that is actually trying to get every shipwreck in the Great Lakes photogrammetry. For those that aren't familiar with photogrammetry is, you swim a camera around, usually a video camera or a fast-taking digital still camera, and there's computer software that will stitch it together, first with a wire model and then a texture model, into a perfect 3D model that can be rotated, examined from any angle. If you got, anything that the camera saw will eventually get stitched together. And it's a way of documenting very complicated shipwrecks that with the old pen and paper would have been impossible to do. And now the photogrammetry, a couple swim arounds, can give you an extremely accurate model for later comparisons to how stable, if things collapsing, what's changed. So they're trying to get a baseline. Unfortunately, low visibility doesn't work so well. So people have tried off of Cleveland with no success. And I don't know of any attempts in the Western Basin. But yeah, people are trying. Okay, I think that's it then.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. And again, we continue to learn things as we do this, as far as not only the subject matter but the process. And so, thank you for hanging with us today, joining us today. I am stopping the recording, and we will see you next month, I hope. Thanks again, Kevin.
Thank you for having me.